The sun was only just rising over the dry plains of the American West, but the heat was already pressing down heavy, as if the land itself carried the same burden as the man who walked it. His name was Samuel Hayes, a rancher by trade, though. These days most folks in town whispered that he was only holding on to dust and memories. His ranch, once filled with the sound of hooves and cattle lowing, had fallen nearly silent. A handful of scrawny cows wandered across the brittle grass, and the barn roof sagged like an old man's back. Samuel was 45, his face weathered, by sun and worry lines carved deeper than any trail in the desert. He'd inherited this land from his father, who had always told him, a rancher's strength is in his stock, his land, and his grit. But grit alone didn't feed cattle during drought, nor pay off debts when the bank came knocking. For years, Samuel had fought to keep the ranch alive. He worked before dawn and long after dusk, pushing his body to the edge, yet the ranch kept slipping through his fingers. Hiring ranch hands was out of the question. He could barely put food on his own table. His neighbors shook their heads at him, some pitying, others mocking. "Hayes is stubborn," they'd say at the saloon. "Too proud to sell, too poor to keep going." Still, Samuel clung to hope. Somewhere deep down, he believed the ranch could be saved, but he knew he couldn't do it alone anymore. One scorching afternoon, Samuel rode into town with the last of his cattle money jingling faintly in his pocket. He had no real plan, only the thought of finding help, someone willing to work hard for little pay. The main street buzzed with trade and chatter, but Samuel's eyes were drawn to a group gathered near the supply store. There, under the harsh sun, stood a row of laborers, men and women alike. Most were barely teenagers, their faces darkened by dust and exhaustion. Samuel's chest tightened. He knew this sight too well. Families selling their children into labor, overseers taking advantage of desperate souls. But then his gaze caught on someone who didn't fit among the young. She was older, much older. Her back was bent, her hands raw and scarred, and though her hair was streaked with gray, her eyes held a strange mixture of defiance and defeat. She didn't belong among the children, yet there she was, treated the same, perhaps worse. "Who's that?" Samuel asked a man nearby. The man gave a low laugh. "That one? She's near 40 but been working like a mule since she was a child. They call her too old for much now, but the overseer keeps her 'cause she'll still swing an axe from sunrise to sunset. Poor thing's got nowhere else to go." Samuel's jaw tightened. A woman, 39 years old, still trapped in child labor, stripped of her dignity, her life wasted under cruel hands. In that moment, something shifted in him. Samuel had come looking for help. But what he saw was more than a laborer. He saw someone whose suffering mirrored his own emptiness. And before the day was through, a decision would rise in his heart, one that would change not only her life, but his, forever. The following morning, Samuel rose before the sun, as he always did. The ranch looked the same, fences leaning, water troughs dry, and fields more dust than grass, but something inside him had shifted after what he'd seen in town. He saddled his weary horse, Duke, and rode out across the property, surveying the land with a heavy heart. The ranch had once been a place of promise. He remembered his father standing tall on the porch pointing at the horizon. "This land is your future, Sam. Treat it with respect, and it'll give you everything you need." But the land had stopped giving years ago. Drought had cracked the earth, rust had eaten through tools he couldn't afford to replace, and banks never waited for rain. Samuel leaned on the fence post, watching one of his last cows stumble weakly. Its ribs jutted out, a painful reminder of how close he was to losing it all. By midday, he was back in town. His pockets felt lighter than ever, but his mind was restless. He passed the blacksmith's shop, the saloon with its swinging doors, and the general store where ranch wives haggled over flour. But his feet carried him toward the place he had stood yesterday, where the overseer gathered laborers for hire. The crowd was thinner today, but she was still there. The gray-haired woman stood apart from the children, her hands bound in coarse rope as though she might flee, though her body told a different story. She wasn't going anywhere. Her shoulders sagged with decades of toil. Yet her eyes followed everything. sharp, watchful, unwilling to surrender completely. Samuel felt a pang deep in his chest. He couldn't explain it, but he recognized that look. It was the same way he stared at his ranch, broken, but refusing to let go. The overseer, a broad man with a sneer carved permanently on his lips, noticed Samuel watching. "Interested, Hayes?" he asked, voice mocking. "Got yourself enough coin to buy help this time?" A few men nearby chuckled. Samuel had a reputation, too poor to hire hands, too proud to quit. But Samuel ignored the laughter and nodded toward the woman. "What about her?" The overseer raised a brow. "Her? She's 39, near 40. Strong as an ox, I'll give her that, but past her prime. Most folks want young workers who can be pushed harder and cheaper. She's not worth much." "Then why keep her?" Samuel pressed. The man shrugged. "Because she'll still work till her bones break, and she don't complain." He grinned wickedly. "But if you want her, I'll sell. She ain't pretty enough to fetch more anywhere else." The cruelty in his tone burned Samuel's ears. He pulled the small pouch of coins from his pocket, the very last of his cattle money. His hands tightened around it. This was supposed to be for feed, or maybe the bank, but instead, "I'll take her," he said firmly. The overseer looked surprised, then laughed. "All yours, rancher. Don't come crying to me when she collapses in the dirt." The exchange was quick. Samuel handed over his precious coins, and the overseer cut the ropes from the woman's wrists. She rubbed the red marks on her skin, glaring at Samuel with suspicion. "You bought me," she said in a rough, weary voice. Samuel shook his head. "No. I bought your freedom. You don't owe me anything." The woman studied him, as if searching for the trick in his words. Life had taught her that every kindness came with a price. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Then don't try to," Samuel replied. "You've had enough taken from you. Come with me if you want. The ranch. It's in bad shape, but it's yours to rest on as long as you need." For the first time in years, perhaps decades, the woman didn't know how to respond. She had been sold, traded, and worked like livestock since she was a child. No one had ever spoken to her like that. She looked past Samuel at the dusty street, the overseer already counting his coins, the townsfolk staring with raised brows. Freedom? The word felt like a story from a book she'd never been allowed to read. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she stepped toward Samuel's horse. And as she climbed into the saddle behind him, the rancher felt something stir in his chest. Not hope yet, but the beginning of it. Because for the first time in years he wasn't riding back to his ranch alone. The ride back to the ranch was silent. Samuel didn't push conversation. He knew better than to crowd someone who had lived under chains for most of her life. He, Tia, could feel her presence behind him on the saddle, rigid, tense, as if ready to leap off and run, should he reveal himself to be no different than the men who had bought and sold her before. When they reached the ranch, Samuel dismounted and helped her down. She glanced around at the broken fences, the sagging barn, the fields where grass once grew thick. Her eyes narrowed. "This is your ranch?" she asked, her tone caught between disbelief and pity. Samuel gave a humorless smile. "What's left of it?" He led her toward the small wooden house, weather-beaten and plain. Inside it smelled faintly of dust and wood smoke. The furniture was sparse but solid, crafted by his father years ago. He pointed to the chair by the hearth. "Sit. You look like you haven't rested in days." She didn't move, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her back stiff. "Why?" she demanded. "Why bring me here? What do you want from me?" Samuel paused, then leaned against the table, arms folded. He met her wary gaze. "I don't want anything from you. You've worked enough for 10 lifetimes. All I did was pay to get you out of that place. You're free now. If you want to stay, you stay. If you want to leave, you leave." Her brow furrowed, suspicion still sharp in her voice. "People don't give without wanting something back." "I'm not people," Samuel said simply. For a long moment, the room was filled only with the crackle of the fireplace. Finally, she lowered herself slowly into the chair, as if her body no longer had the strength to argue with him. That night, Samuel gave her his late mother's room, still neat though unused for years. He heard her moving about cautiously, as though afraid of breaking something, before the house fell quiet. The days that followed were uneasy. The woman, her name he learned was Miriam, kept her distance. She spoke little, ate little, and worked too much. At dawn, she was already outside, hauling buckets, patching fences, sweeping the porch. Samuel tried to tell her she didn't have to, but her hands refused to be idle. It was in her eyes that he saw the truth. She didn't know how to live without chains. Freedom frightened her more than bondage, because it meant choice, and choice was something she'd been denied since childhood. One afternoon, Samuel returned from town with a sack of flour and a small bundle of apples. He found Miriam mending a broken gate with a stubborn determination. Her palms were raw, blood blisters forming. "You'll tear your hands to pieces," he said, moving to take the hammer from her. She jerked back, eyes blazing. "Don't touch me." Samuel froze, then slowly stepped away. He saw the trembling in her shoulders, the way her whole body tensed as if bracing for a blow that never came. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quietly. "You don't have to prove anything. This place, it's not a prison." Her breath shuddered, but she turned back to the gate without answering. That night, as Samuel sat by the fire, Miriam finally spoke. Her voice was low but steady. "I was sold when I was 7. They told me I'd work until I could no longer stand. And I did. Every day, year after year. If I slowed down, I was beaten. If I cried, I was mocked. The only way to survive was to keep my hands moving." Samuel's chest ached at her words. He didn't interrupt. He simply listened. "I don't know what to do with rest," she admitted. "I don't know what freedom feels like." Samuel met her eyes across the flickering firelight. "Then maybe we can learn together." For the first time since she had stepped onto his ranch, Miriam's expression softened. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the first crack in the walls she had built around her heart. And Samuel knew then, saving her had not been an act of charity. It was the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet, something that just might save them both. Morning light spilled over the plains, touching the ranch with a faint glow of promise. For Samuel, mornings had long felt like burdens, another day of labor and disappointment. But lately, he noticed something different when he stepped outside. The sound of movement, the sight of Miriam already at work, the quiet determination she carried in her every step. She never asked what needed doing. She simply noticed and acted. When the chicken coop door hung loose, she fixed it with scrap wood. When the barn roof leaked, she patched it with tar and cloth. When Samuel mentioned how the garden had dried up years ago, she spent a full day, turning the soil with a shovel, her back bent, sweat running down her temples until the land gave way again. At first, Samuel tried to stop her. "You don't owe me this," he'd say, reaching for the tools in her hands. But Miriam only shook her head. "I can't sit idle," she replied. "And this ranch, it's as broken as I am. Maybe fixing it will help me too." Samuel didn't argue after that. He simply worked beside her. Days turned into weeks and the ranch began to change. It wasn't sudden. There were still debts, still dry patches of land, still cattle too thin for market. But there was life again. Flowers sprouted. Where Miriam scattered seeds, chickens clucked more lively with their coop repaired. The porch was swept clean, and Samuel could almost hear the echo of laughter that had once filled the place when his parents were alive. One evening, Samuel came in from repairing a corral to find the kitchen filled with the smell of stew. Miriam stood at the stove, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, stirring carefully. "You cooked?" he asked, surprised. She nodded, her voice soft but steady. "It's been years since I had a kitchen. I almost forgot the joy in it." They ate together at the small wooden table, and for the first time the silence between them felt warm rather than tense. Samuel noticed how Miriam's face seemed less hardened, the lines of weariness easing ever so slightly. Later, As the fire crackled in the hearth, she spoke. All those years I thought I'd die working in those camps. Every sunrise was the same. No purpose, no end. But here, she looked around the small home, her voice trembling. Here, I feel like maybe I'm not just surviving, maybe I'm living. Samuel felt a lump rise in his throat. He had brought her here thinking only of her freedom, but he realized now she was giving him something too. He had been drowning in loneliness, despair, and silence. But Miriam filled those empty spaces, not with grand words or promises, but with simple presence. Not everyone saw it that way. In town, whispers began to spread. Some mocked Samuel openly. Hayes couldn't find a wife, so he brought home a half-ruined labor woman. They sneered at the saloon. Others shook their heads in disbelief. He should have taken a strong young worker if he wanted help. What good is a woman near 40? Samuel heard the words but paid them no mind. He knew strength when he saw it, and Miriam carried more strength than any man he'd met. Still, Miriam noticed the stares when she ventured into town for supplies. Women whispered, men looked away, children pointed. She lowered her eyes and hurried beside Samuel, the old weight of shame settling on her shoulders. That night she asked quietly, "Why do they look at me like that? Like I don't belong?" Samuel's voice was firm. "Because they don't understand. They've never carried what you've carried. But I see you, Miriam, and I won't let their words steal what you've worked to rebuild." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and for the first time she didn't turn away when Samuel's hand brushed gently against hers. As weeks passed, the ranch grew stronger, and so did they. Miriam began to smile more, faint at first, then brighter. Samuel caught himself laughing again, something he thought he had forgotten how to do. The ranch, once filled only with silence and sorrow, began to hum with the steady rhythm of two broken souls learning to heal together. And though Samuel didn't yet call it hope, he could feel it stirring quietly in the soil, in the air, and in his heart, like a seed waiting to bloom. The nights grew cooler as autumn settled across the plains. Samuel found that he looked forward to evenings by the fire, when the day's work was done and silence stretched comfortably between him and Miriam. Sometimes they spoke little, sometimes not at all. Yet there was a peace in her presence that he hadn't felt in years. But Samuel also knew Miriam carried a weight she had not yet shared. He saw it in the way her eyes lingered on the horizon, in the restless movements of her hands when she wasn't working, in the shadows that crossed her face when laughter flickered too close. One evening after supper, he poured 2 mugs of coffee and slid one across the table toward her. The firelight danced between them. "Tell me," he said gently. "Tell me what they did to you." Miriam's fingers tightened around the mug. For a long while she said nothing, only staring at the rising steam. Then, slowly, the words began to spill. "I was 7 when my father lost everything," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "He had debts he couldn't pay, and the overseers came to collect. They didn't want money, they wanted workers. So he handed me over, told me I'd come back once the debt was cleared. I never did." She swallowed hard, staring into the flames. "From that day on, I was property. I picked cotton till my fingers bled. I hauled timber till my back bent. When I was older, they put me with the men, swinging an axe from dawn to dusk. Food was scraps. Sleep was a luxury. And if you faltered," her voice trembled, "if you faltered, the whip reminded you to keep moving." Samuel's jaw tightened, his fists curling against the table. He pictured a little girl forced into endless toil, growing into a woman without childhood, without rest, without dignity. The thought hollowed his chest with rage. Miriam went on. Years became decades. People came and went, children taken, young women sold, boys beaten till they never rose again. But me, I endured. And sometimes I cursed myself for it. Because what was I enduring for? I had no family, no home, no future. I thought I would die nameless, a ghost no one remembered. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't hide. Them. For once, she let them fall. Then you came. You paid for me. And when I thought you'd put me back in chains, you gave me freedom instead. I didn't know how to accept it. I still don't. Samuel's throat felt tight. He reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers. For a moment she flinched, then slowly, cautiously, she let his touch remain. I know what it means to lose everything, Samuel said quietly. I had a wife once, Mary. She was gentle, kind. She dreamed of filling this house with children, but she fell ill one winter and by spring she was gone. After that, the ranch became nothing but work and silence. Every day I tried to keep it alive for her sake, but it's been slipping away. Some nights I wondered if I should just let it die, same as she did. Miriam looked at him, her tear-streaked face softening. You've been carrying grief just as long as I've carried chains. He nodded. Maybe that's why I saw you that day. Maybe I recognized a soul just as lost as mine. For a while, they sat in silence, their hands still joined across the table, the fire crackling low. The air felt heavy, but not with despair. Rather, with something unspoken, something fragile and new. Miriam whispered, I thought I was too broken to ever matter again. But here, working beside you, I feel human. Samuel's voice was rough. You are more than human, Miriam. You're stronger than anyone I've ever met. And if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my days proving that to you. The firelight flickered in her eyes, and though she didn't answer with words, the faintest trembling smile touched her lips. That night Samuel lay awake in his bed staring at the ceiling. For years he had lived in silence, his heart sealed shut. But now, with Miriam's story etched into him, he felt a stirring he hadn't known in decades. Not just sympathy, not just companionship. It was the fragile beginning of love. Winter winds swept across the plains, rattling the loose boards of the barn and carrying the scent of smoke from the chimney. Life on the ranch had settled into rhythm. Samuel and Miriam, working side by side, repairing what was broken, sharing quiet meals and slowly weaving comfort into each other's days. For Samuel, the loneliness that once haunted every corner of his house had begun to fade. For Miriam, the chains of her past had loosened, replaced by a sense of belonging she had never known. But the world outside their ranch was not so forgiving. In town, the whispers had grown sharper. Hayes could have hired a real worker, but he brought home a washed-up old woman. He's lost his senses, spending good coin on someone past her prime. Some women snickered when Miriam passed with a basket of supplies, while men muttered that Samuel was a fool for keeping her. Miriam tried to ignore it, but each word cut deep, reopening old scars of worthlessness. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the last of the sunlight slip behind the hills, Miriam finally spoke. They look at me as if I don't belong, Samuel. Like I'm still a slave even though you freed me. Samuel turned to her, his voice firm. You don't answer to them. You've earned more respect in a few months than most of them earn in a lifetime. She shook her head. You don't understand. People like me, we never escape our past. To them, I'll always be what I was, a laborer, not a woman worthy of dignity. Samuel's hand found hers, warm and steady. To me, you are worthy of everything. Before she could respond, the sound of hooves thundered down the dirt road. A group of riders approached, dust swirling around them. At the front was a broad man with a cruel grin. Miriam recognized him instantly. The overseer. He swung down from his horse, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. Well, well, he drawled. I figured I'd find her here. Thought, you could just buy her once and keep her forever, Hayes? Samuel stepped forward, his jaw clenched. I didn't buy her to keep. I bought her freedom. She's not yours anymore. The overseer laughed harshly. Freedom? Don't fool yourself. She's been under contract since she was a child. Paperwork says she's property of the camps until she dies. And I don't care what coin you gave me that day. She still belongs to me. Miriam's face went pale, her hands trembling at her sides. She had dreamed of this moment, dreaded it, chains snapping back around her wrists, dragging her into the darkness she thought she had escaped. But Samuel stood tall, his voice low and steady. No. She belongs to no one. Not anymore. The mom. Overseer's smile vanished. You'd risk yourself for her? She's nothing, Hayes. A worn-out worker, not worth the trouble. Samuel's eyes blazed. She is worth everything. The overseer stepped closer, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The air grew tense, silence hanging heavy except for the restless snorts of the horses. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she thought Samuel would back down, that the weight of debt, poverty, and isolation would crush him now. But instead, Samuel squared his shoulders. You set one boot on this land again and I'll make sure you regret it. His hand rested near his own gun, calm but certain. The overseer glared at him, then spat in the dirt. You'll regret this, Hayes. You can't protect her forever. He swung back into his saddle, motioning to his men. With a final sneer, they turned and rode off into the gathering night. When the sound of hooves faded, Miriam collapsed onto Bas, the porch steps, her hands covering her face. He'll come back, she whispered. They always come back. Men like him never let go. Samuel knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. Let him try. I'm not letting anyone take you. Again, not while I draw breath. Tears streamed down Miriam's face, but this time they weren't only of fear. They were of something deeper, something she had never dared to feel before. Safety, protection, love. In that moment, as the cold night wrapped around them, Miriam realized Samuel wasn't just the man who had freed her. He was the man who would fight for her, even when the world called her worthless. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her life could truly begin. Again. The days after the overseer's visit were heavy with unease. Samuel kept his rifle near the door, his eyes always scanning the horizon. Miriam worked as she always did, but her movements carried a nervous edge, as if every gust of wind or distant hoofbeat might herald her return to chains. One evening, as Samuel repaired a fence, he found her standing near the corral, her gaze distant. You should have let me go, she whispered when he came close. Samuel frowned. Go? Where? Anywhere. Now he knows where I am. He'll come back. And when he does, he won't just take me. He'll destroy you too. I can't let you lose everything because of me. Samuel set the hammer aside and stepped in front of her. Miriam, listen to me. I've already lost too much in this life, my wife, my family, nearly my ranch. I won't lose you too, not without a fight. Her eyes shone with tears. Why risk so much for me? Because, Samuel said, his voice low and certain, you're not just someone I freed. You've become the reason this place is alive again. The reason I'm alive again. That night Miriam prayed for strength, something she hadn't done in years. And Samuel sat awake on the porch, the rifle across his knees, waiting. Days stretched into weeks, and though the overseer never returned, the tension slowly melted into determination. Miriam refused to let fear define her anymore. Instead of shrinking back, she leaned into the life they were building together. She tended the garden until green shoots broke through the soil. She sewed curtains for the windows, filling the house with small touches of warmth. She even laughed now, soft, unexpected bursts of joy that filled the rooms with light Samuel hadn't heard since his wife's passing. The ranch began to thrive again. With Miriam's steady hand and Samuel's grit, the fences were rebuilt. The herd grew stronger, and neighbors who had once mocked now looked on in quiet astonishment. Some even offered to trade or lend a hand, though Samuel never forgot how they had sneered before. But what mattered most wasn't the ranch. It was Miriam herself. The woman who had once carried only chains now carried hope. The woman who had been treated as less than human stood tall, her back straight, her eyes alive. One crisp morning, Samuel found her standing on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky with shades of gold and crimson. He stepped beside her, silence wrapping them in a tender embrace. "You've changed this place," he said quietly. "You've changed me." Miriam turned to him, her expression soft. "And you gave me what I never thought I'd have. Freedom. Dignity. A home." She hesitated, then added in a trembling whisper, "And love." Samuel's heart swelled, the words he'd held back finally rising. "I love you, Miriam. Not because of what you've done for this ranch, but because of who you are. Strong, brave, worth more than you'll ever know." Tears glistened in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. She reached for his hand, her fingers lacing with his. For the first time, she didn't feel like a burden. She felt chosen, cherished. The overseer never came back. Maybe he realized Samuel Hayes was not a man to be crossed. Or maybe he understood that Miriam was no longer the broken worker he could control. Either way, his shadow faded from their lives, leaving room only for light. Years later, neighbors would tell the story of how the struggling rancher found salvation not in fortune or luck, but in the strength of a woman the world had discarded. They would speak of Samuel and Miriam with quiet respect, no longer mocking but marveling at what they had built together. And on the ranch itself, the land flourished, cattle roamed strong, and laughter returned to the house. Miriam often walked the fields at dusk, the same fields where she once feared her past would catch her. Now, she walked them as a free woman, with Samuel's arm often around her shoulders, and peace finally in her heart. For in the end, the truth was simple. Two broken lives had found each other, and in their union they had discovered what the world could not give them: healing, hope, and a love that changed everything.